So, very good morning to you, grade 9s, or early afternoon, I suppose. Today we're going to continue. I'll give you your marks back for your presentations. There are 3 or 4 of you still have to hand it in, but we'll sort that out next week. Okay, so today we're going to do one of the really controversial parts of apartheid history. We're going to look at forced removals. So if we understood from the Group Areas Act, not to be confused with the Land Act. So the 1913 Land Act designated land to a particular race group, with the whites getting about 87% of the mainly farming land. Cities would also then be designated as white. But the problem in cities is that even though it was supposedly for whites only, they did want black people to live in the city because they needed people to do the manual labor, to work as domestics or gardeners or the other manual labor that was required. And so the Group Areas Act was completely different. We'll come on to that in a second. So the Group Areas Act of 1950, one of the very early acts after apartheid started in 1948, it determined where people could live on the basis of their race within a city. So I think I used the example when we last spoke that if you look at Wellington itself would have been classified white, Newton would have been classified, and Van Wyksvlei would have been classified coloured, and Mbekweni would have been classified black, just as an example. And lines were literally drawn on towns and maps. And the problem now occurred that if you now that this law had become law, what happens to a black person who was suddenly living in a white area? I mean, I always get asked, was it a problem for white people to live in black areas? Not really. The whites obviously were a lot more wealthy because of the privilege that they had. So they tended to stay in the best suburbs or areas. And those best suburbs or areas were almost always reserved for white people. But there was a huge problem with black occupation. And so a horrible time in our history was started. It was known as the time of forced removals, where black or colored people who are now living in an area that was supposedly deemed to be white now had to move. And the two best examples, we're only going to do one. The best example for me, because it's local, is District 6, which is just on the outskirts of Cape Town when you drive in. But the one we're going to study is one in Gauteng, that's Sophiatown, and there was a forced removal there in 1955. So I think the first thing is to just get a sense of what Sophiatown was. It was in the city of Johannesburg, our biggest city, and it was a racially mixed suburb. So even before the Group Areas Act, there was racism was rife. So white, colored, and black people, as a rule, didn't tend to live together out of choice, or it was a sort of a social taboo. It was frowned upon. But there were about 70,000 people there. Most of them were Africans or black, but there were a large number of Indians and coloreds and even a handful of whites. Sophiatown was regarded as a slum. It was a very poor housing, a lot of informal housing, and it was also a suburb of contradictions. So you can look up the contradiction if you don't want to know what it means, but it's where one thought or action or viewpoint contradicts another. So it was filthy, it was overcrowded, it was, after all, a slum, but it was also the home to a new black culture. It was vibrant, full of excitement. There was dancing and jazz music, and yeah, it was a slap in the face to the government, who claimed that white, colored, Indian, and black couldn't live together peacefully, and that's why they had to have it removed. So this just gives you a sense, these figures of who was living there at the time. Most of the white people had moved out. The main reason that they moved out actually was a sewage works had been located very close to it. And of course it was very smelly. So it was mainly Africans, 54,000, with a smaller colored Indian and even a Chinese population there. Sophiatown was the most perfect experiment in non-racial community living. On the whole, people lived a raceless existence. What we have today, what we take for granted today, where all people are treated the same regardless of race, Whatever else Sophiatown was, it was home. We took the ugliness of life in a slum and wove it into a kind of beauty. So I think we've got to be a little bit careful not to romanticize Sophiatown. It was some people, by the way, say Sophiatown. Either is acceptable, but it was very definitely a slum, and it was very poor. And obviously, there would have been crime, for example, but there was this wonderful, vibrant culture. So this is one of our apartheid heroes, Father Trevor Huddleston. He was a priest at Sophiatown's Anglican Church from 1943 to 1955, and he became a leading figure in the attempt to stop the forced removals in 1955. And this is Blok Modisani. He grew up in Sophiatown and worked for a journalist for a famous magazine of the time, Dram magazine, in the early 1950s. Okay, so this is a description of Sophiatown's children. You will be walking across the playground and suddenly feel a tug at your sleeve or a pressure on your knee. And there will be a sticky hand in yours. You are home. Your children are around you. 10 of them, 100, 1,000. You belong to them, and they will never let you forget it. And then another comment on Sophiatown. Sophiatown was crime-ridden, yet heaved with music and wishes and dreams. Isn't that a nice, very, very vibrant verb that is used? It heaved with music and wishes and dreams. Okay, so this is a photograph of Sophiatown in the early 1950s before the forced removal. And this person here, some of you might have heard of, famous musician Miriam Makeba. I think she passed away recently. And she's now in the 1950s, obviously as a very young lady, surrounded by her friends and audience in Sophiatown. Oops. Okay, then this is, we mentioned Drum Magazine, which was a magazine mainly for the black youth, and it reflected the changes taking place amongst urban black South Africans, particularly the educated ones and those with better jobs. And it started to change the way that black people were represented in society. That old sort of ethnic view or tribal view that we had. They started to wear modern clothing. They started to take part in the music of the time, jazz music. I think jazz music would have been a bit like sort of heavy metal in my day. It was the alternative to classical music. And it was something that the youth did almost sometimes in defiance of the elders. Okay, so when I'm finished, this is what you're going to be doing. I forget offhand what page it's on, but I did put it in my notes. Yeah, it's on page 183. And I want you to answer those questions there, all of them, please. Okay, so now we come on to, now that we have a sense of what Sophiatown was, we're going to talk about the forced removal. So by the early 1950s, the apartheid government was making plans for the destruction of Sophiatown and the removal of its residents. Residents and political activists who protested against the removal resisted the government's plans. And again, the government felt it was necessary to do this forced removal in order to do away with a multiracial suburb, which they claimed could never work because race groups, according to their doctrine, could never live peacefully together. So that was why it was needed to happen. The liberation group at the time, the ANC, led the anti-removal campaign. There were rallies, thousands of people attended, and then the slogan, "Ons dak nie, we won't move, ons polla hier, we won't move, we live here." But it didn't work, unfortunately. In 1955, 2,000 policemen armed with guns, knopkieries and rifles began to move the community of Sophiatown out of their homes by force. Africans were moved to the newly constructed township of Meadowlands. I think some of you might have heard a song called Meadowlands. I'll play it for you when we get back. And it was many miles southwest of Johannesburg. The colored people were moved to an area that was deemed now for coloreds in El Dorado Park, and the Indian community moved to Lenasia, and the Chinese people moved to central Johannesburg. So we have a situation now where people are now being forced to move into the group area that they are designated for based on their color. So this is a description of why the community of Sophiatown was destroyed. The government scheme was not slum clearance but robbery. Robbery carried out in the interests of and under pressure from the neighboring white suburbs. Sophiatown, they gave it a lovely name. I'm just going to write it down here. When you had a predominantly black area in a white area, they called it a black spot. So you think of a Dalmatian, for example. If you had a Dalmatian has a circular black spot which is surrounded by white fur, and that's what it was to the Group Areas Act. The main reason they wanted to get rid of Sophiatown was that it was seen as a black spot. It was a black area surrounded by a white area, and even though it was close to a sewer and whites didn't really want to live there, they didn't want black people to live in close proximity to them either. And then down here, a description of the feelings of a Sophiatown resident. My mind recoiled with anger and a little with fear. I had not realized the scope of the destruction. It was a wasteland. And so here you have some pictures. This is the South African police arriving in trucks to force people to move from Sophiatown. They loaded them up using rifles and guns. And then Sophiatown, like District 6 in the Cape, was simply bulldozed, evacuated and destroyed under the Group Areas Act. They rebuilt it as a white working class suburb, so sort of a poorer white area. And guess what they called it? Triumph, which means triumph or victory in Afrikaans. And one of the questions is to try work out why they used that name. The sad reality is that white people didn't actually want to live there because it was close to a sewer, and it was obviously a very poor area, so it wasn't a triumph at all. A, it was unfair, and B, many white people chose not to live there. Jane Dakile recalls the moment at 5:30 a.m. on Thursday, the 10th of November, 1958, when officials came to force the family out. Hey, my birthday, 10th of November. I wasn't born in 1958, though. And by the way, they often did arrive at that time. It would probably still have been dark. People are at their lowest ebb at dawn or just before dawn. And this is what Jane Dakile had to say. Before we had even opened the door, I just heard the hammer on the pillar of the veranda, a big sound that made me wonder if I was dying. That sound went right into my heart, and I shall never forget it. We had to take everything and throw it outside. Imagine taking your washing just as it is, a chair just as it is. I felt such pity for my husband because he had built that house with his bare hands. That house was our one and only little kingdom. We had our freedom there in Sophiatown, and that day I felt we were losing our rights. My friends in the yard and the old spirit of the people I live with. Some heart-wrenching words. Right, and just then to finish, you can do this on the same doc, or you can do it in your books as you're doing activity 3. There are 5 simple questions that I want you to answer there. Please drop me a line if you have any questions. Please, you must complete activity 3 and 4 today. Either submit a picture of your work if you've written in your book, or submit a doc before midnight. Have a good